So welcome to this webinar. Thank you for joining me, whether it's in person or you're listening to the recording. My name is Ian Gotts. I'm one of the co-founders of Elements and delighted to spend time with you today. People talk to me about Elements and say that the scope of the product is so broad, the benefits are huge, and sometimes it can be somewhat overwhelming. Yes, they can see that there are huge benefits if they transform the way that they deliver Salesforce, but the request sometimes has been, like, could you just tell me the one thing that would make the biggest difference? Can you just focus it? If I could only do one thing that gives me the biggest result, what would it be? And that really is the reason we put this webinar together. So there's a concept called shift left, and the whole idea of capturing issues early and therefore massively reducing the cost of rework. And I want to spend a bit of time today just thinking about how shift left as a principle works, but then also how it can be applied inside your Salesforce org. So I think everybody understands is the earlier you catch an issue, the easier it is. If you catch an issue when it's in production, it's clearly everyone running around with their hair on fire. It's a huge cost, systems down, customers can't use it, your end users can't use it. But I don't think people really recognize the cost or the size of the difference. So there was a bit of research done a number of years ago. You can read the paper if you want, it's 309 pages, but I've summarized this as just the one slide there, which says that it is 10 times cheaper to catch something at requirement stage than it is after release. And I guess that's obvious. The earlier you catch it, the less cost, but I don't think people understand the scale of the difference. So what we're saying is if you can pick out, I know, conflicts in user stories, in metadata changes, if you can make sure you're building the things that your end users want and catch that at the requirements definition phase before we even start coding, testing, getting it live, a massive, massive reduction in cost. Hence the whole idea that if you can apply the shift left principles, you can probably save up to 80% in terms of rework. But it's not just rework. Clearly, any changes you have to make, if you make them early, you can save 80% of that. But you can also save 100% of the changes that the users don't need. How many times do you build something because the user thought they wanted it, and then you discover that they don't actually use it? If you'd really dug in and asked the questions about what they really needed, you may never needed to build it at all. So again, shift left, doing that analysis up front, is helping you reduce any effort building things that never get used. And I'm sure if you look through your org, you'll see hundreds of fields that somebody definitely wanted and have never ever used. In fact, we had one customer the other day, massive org we were synchronizing, 256 record types on an object, 140 pick lists, and some of those pick list fields had hundreds of pick list items. So that means, for those of you who understand how record types and pick lists work, every pick list value has to be assigned to a record type. So that combination, I think, was 5 million different items in that metadata in that object for the combination of pick list values matched to the record types. And you go, well, wow, that's just a huge effort. But then if I tell you that all but one of those record types was not used, a huge cost. Okay, I don't have any of the backstory. I have no idea the history of this, but clearly it was important to have built it. There was effort put into it, but then the business had moved on, and therefore that functionality was never used. The other thing we've discovered is that you can accelerate your DevOps from weeks to days. So what that means is if you have a better understanding about what the risk of a user story is, you can decide whether it needs to go through the highly development test, integration test, so a very hands-on and expensive process. If you could somehow identify those user stories which were lower risk, maybe you could put them through, say, a more expedited process, which means you could get them out in days. Or if they're really low risk, maybe you could actually accelerate some of those changes and get them not from days, but down it out into hours. And obviously there is a saving in terms of development cost, but the real benefit, of course, is to the end users who are getting the changes into their org more quickly, and they can be more productive more quickly. The other thing we see there is that the act of understanding what the business really needs sometimes identifies business improvement savings. And we've been in the business analysis world for the last 20 years. Typically, we see 25% or more comes out of simply getting people to understand what they're meant to be doing, getting everybody on the same page. And then the last one is obvious. I mean, we need to reduce downtime from broken orgs. The number of times where we put something live, suddenly realize there's a conflict, the org's down, nobody can use it. That is massively stressful for everybody involved. And if we can avoid that, then obviously that's important. So if we think about the implementation lifecycle, this is our view of it. I'm sure that you're doing something very similar to this. You're certainly capturing ideas and feedback. You're turning those ideas and feedback and then adding some strategic change into a set of business requirements. You're validating those, thinking about the business process, whether you're doing it very formally through a business process map or whether you're working with end users to understand what their process is. You're identifying what changes need to be made, that fit gap. And then you're coming out with a set of user stories and identify the changes you need to make to your metadata. I think the things we're suggesting is you also need to think about the risk and impact of those user stories. So then when you pass the user story to build and test, they have an accurate view about what needs to be built, an understanding about how much effort needs to be spent in terms of develop and test, and again, whether they can be fast-tracked. And obviously then we're releasing the app, releasing the documentation, and then used in production. So in terms of shift left, we're talking about a couple of things. One is build the right thing. Make sure we're building what the end users genuinely need, not what they thought they wanted. Make sure that we understand we're building it in the right way. We've architected it correctly. Often the users come to us with a request. We discover that actually that's already part of core functionality. So we've already satisfied that requirement by simply saying, yeah, it works that way. Maybe we need to improve the training to make sure that you really understand how to use it. So there may be some very quick wins that come out of this. And then the second part is build the thing right, making sure that we have sufficient information to do the testing correctly. I did a webinar a couple of weeks ago with Provar testing about how the whole front end in terms of building user stories helps the automated testing be more accurate and make sure that you've not forgotten any metadata items that were in a user story to make sure you're building the correct tests. So there is a yin and yang between the whole front-end analysis and the back-end delivery, and we need to make sure those two work in concert. And obviously shift left is all about, can we identify and get a clearer picture about what we need earlier in the life cycle? Can we identify conflicts earlier? Can we identify the business changes and the business risk earlier so it doesn't come back and surprise us and bite us when we're in production? So I said we'll try and do this and make this really simple. So can we do one thing? Let's not worry about the entire life cycle I've just talked about. Let's just worry about one thing that we could do which would make a tangible difference that every one of you could do relatively easily and that you could implement. There's no point having massive ideas if it's impossible to get buy-in from senior management. It's well beyond the remit of what you do. So if you're listening to this and saying, okay, give me the one thing that I could do that can make a difference tomorrow and make my life better, then these three simple principles I want to go through and just show you how it could work. Obviously, I'm going to show you how it works in Elements. If you're using other systems, then you could apply those principles to the way you're currently working. So the first thing is we want to try and manage all our user stories centrally, not in a series of disparate spreadsheets. We've got some over here in a custom object. We've got some over here in a Word doc. So let's try and capture all those user stories centrally, but then manage them. So have a formal process for managing through their status. Simple thing, let's get them all in a pile in one place. Second thing, let's see if we can group those user stories by release. So if we have a release coming out, we have a series of user stories, and the reason we need to do that is we then understand how those user stories may interact with each other, either conflicts or supportive. And then the third thing is linking the metadata to those user stories. And that's really where the magic happens. the ability to understand the conflicts around the user stories around metadata, and that's obviously where we're stopping the org getting broken. So let's discover that now, not in build or in the release tools. Far better to have those conversations now about what the conflicts might be when it's really cheap to fix those problems. Back to the whole concept of shift left. So 3 simple principles, and let me show you how this might work in practice. So we're in Elements. Elements is a platform sitting on AWS. So when I'm talking about user stories and business change, this could apply to absolutely anything. Could apply to Salesforce clearly, because we're very active in the Salesforce market, but also it could apply to any other business change, any other business systems. So here is a list of user stories. You can see that, fine, it looks like a spreadsheet. There are lots of fields here, but the important point is that there is a status. We're managing them through a status. This one is at the being considered phase. We're also applying a risk. So if we look at any item here in the right-hand panel, we're starting to understand a bit more about that particular user story. It happens to be linked to a requirement. This one happens to be integrated or synchronized with Jira. And I'll talk a moment about how we get user stories in. Some descriptions, we could assign it to somebody. We can then look at the risk associated with any user story. So we can put a general risk assessment. We think this is one is medium. Maybe I actually want to look in more detail about, say, the impact and the complexity, which will then give me, again, a better view about why this is a medium risk user story. So either put the risk at the highest level or dig in and go, right, what's the technical risk? What's the operational risk? What's the regulatory risk of this change? How complex is it? And those different risks may help you come up with what you think that risk assessment is. And the next thing is starting to connect any Salesforce metadata. This is linked to an object. It happens to be linked to 3 things: a custom object, a field, and another field in the object called vaccination. And again, obviously, any metadata items could be linked to a user story. Again, often the challenge is that we create a user story, we think about the metadata items that should be attached, and then we don't realize that there are other metadata items we should have attached, and that's where the problems are caused. So it's not necessarily a conflict, it's actually we've actually didn't realize there were other things needed to be added. You can obviously at the same time add any documentation, so you could maybe link it to a process diagram if you've drawn it, so you can start to see the implications of which processes are likely to get changed because of this particular user story. And again, that will start to help you identify the operational impact or the regulatory impact. If we're changing this business process, how big a change is it? How are we going to change the end users in terms of their operation? Does it have a regulatory impact? Are there some compliance that we will have to change or consider based on this user story? So again, you don't have to get into this level of detail, but once you've got the concept of a user story, you can then start to think about the risks and start to think about the relationships with other things you've already got. Salesforce metadata, process diagrams. These ones happen to be inside Elements, but they could be Lucid charts, they could be Visio diagrams. And again, it could be other documentation, it could be notes, it could be links to a specification. So think of the user story as the key piece of technical work that's going to be passed to your technical team. Now, so let's think about, we've got a whole set of user stories here. They're all in the being considered phase. If I go and change the status of this one and say we now think this one is in design, update it to being in design, and I could now, if I go across to and find where that went to, it's now active. So it's now in design. I could edit this, and I can now assign it to a release. So I can see there are 3 releases that are currently open. I'm going to assign it to that release. I could also at the same point assign it to somebody. It's already connected to a Jira project. So I'm now looking at our list of user stories, but actually, the second thing I said is you want to assign user stories to releases. Before we launch into that, let's just think about how we capture these user stories. 3 ways you can get them. Number 1 is clearly you can connect them to Jira, and we have a synchronization with Jira. So you would keep your Jira user stories and our user stories in sync. So this is the Jira user story gives you is used by the development team, and the user stories we here are really more business oriented. But because we have a synchronization and keep the two in sync, then as the status changes, it gets reflected all the way through. Also, this right-hand panel is visible inside Jira. So if I opened up Jira, everything that we're seeing here is visible inside Jira. It just takes a while for Jira to wind itself up, and eventually that right-hand panel will appear there. See, it's still working. As it's relatively slow at the moment, let me come back to that in a moment. So that's the first way that you can connect and create all your user stories. The second is here. You can import from a CSV file. So if you have your user stories currently sitting in, say, a custom object or an Excel spreadsheet, you could export them and then actually stop using those and start using Elements as the master for all your user stories. Clearly, the benefit, of course, is that these user stories have a lot more metadata associated with them. Multiple people can access it based on their Elements user access. And the third way that you can create a user story is clearly you can click and add new. So you can start creating them from here. You can add them new when you're, say, if you're in a process diagram, you could add a new user story there. If you're sitting inside a Salesforce metadata item, you can add a new user story there. So as you're working your way through the analysis, you can start to add user stories as you go along. Let's see whether that has now finished. There we go. If I pop that right panel, I'm in Jira here, for those of you who don't recognize it, but everything I was looking at inside Elements for this user story, you can see is now inside Jira. So if your dev teams are working in Jira, they now get access to all the insights and all the information that you've been putting in associated with that user story. And again, if they have Elements access, Elements licenses, they can start to add their own documentation if they want to. So that's step 1. Step 1 is, can I get all my user stories in the same place? Can I manage them through a formal cycle, through a formal set of statuses? Can I connect all the supporting information to make that user story really valuable for me as the admin, as the business analyst, as the platform owner, but then also can we pass that across the development team? We wouldn't pass it across the development team unless we had it grouped by release. So as I said, we have the concept of a release inside Elements, and here are 2 user stories inside this release called Major Release 1. In fact, if I do a refresh, if you remember, I just went and added that 3rd user story to this particular release. So now we have 3 user stories in this release. I could also have process diagrams and requirements in this release. But at the moment, let's keep it simple. We're just focused on the user stories. So now if I look at this user story, I can now see that this user story touches a number of metadata items. If I look at this one here, same. I'm looking at how it impacts a couple of dashboards. This one happens to touch 6 things in the account object. And you can see here, we're even seeing what the changes are likely to be made to that metadata item based on this user story. We're going to delete this record, this layout, page layout. We're going to update these two, update this page layout, update this field. Oh, interesting, we're going to delete that field. So again, there may be some issues there. And we're going to create a brand new field called account type. if I look maybe in another user story, so no, over here, as I said, you can see a number of different metadata items attached. So the question is how do I attach those? So let me just take you to the Salesforce org model. So this is a view of your Salesforce implementation. Every item of metadata, or certainly all the key ones, are pulled out, custom objects, managed packages, and they are in this tree structure. So you can look at any one of these, click there. This happens to be a dashboard. So again, you've got a number of different tabs here. The cleanup tab, so I can start to tag items that need to be cleaned up. The dependencies, documentation, and then user stories. Everything has got these major tabs, but if I go down to say an object level, there's a lot more, we pull a lot more information for you. So let's think about over here, we have got, this is everything about this object called applicant, how many custom fields, how many records by record type, and then we do an assessment of every single field. But what's important for this conversation is we can see that this particular object is being touched by two user stories, one ready for implementation and one there that's in design. And again, we can see which release. This one's in release 2. This one is also in release 2. Let's go down and see if we can find that field that we were looking at in that last user story, which was earned value. So there we go. There's a field called earned value. We can see it's being used in a user story, and we think it's ready for implementation. The beauty of this tree and the analysis that we do is that we use the metadata and the dependency APIs and our own code to give you this view. We'll tell you, first of all, we say that we think this field is high impact because it's used in formula fields and page layouts. If we look a bit further down, this is the analysis we do for you. We're telling you it's in 2 formula fields. It's in 7 page layouts. Clearly some of those could be deleted. It's in 3 reports. It's used in 3 validation rules. And again, if I roll over those, anywhere you see this little blue icon, that means I can click there and it will open up this item in Salesforce Setup, and then this right panel will appear, just the same way as we had that right panel in Jira. So that's given me a view about where this field is used. But what we can also do, we have a dependency tree. What that means is we can look down not just at the field, but where this field is being used, but then where those things are being used. So it's obviously, so now you can see that there's the field we're focused on. We can see that it's used in these page layouts, these validation rules, and these 2 custom fields. But because there's a little blue plus, that shows that, wow, it's also used elsewhere. And again, this happens to be a custom field which opens up at any one of these, any metadata item. We can then go from that metadata item and show you where else it's used. And that custom field is used elsewhere. So if I'm looking at this earned value field, and maybe that's the one that I've got in my user story, maybe I should also include these fields, or maybe this validation rule, or maybe even this custom field inside that user story to make sure I've considered it. So how many times do you get asked, oh, can you just make a change to that field? It won't be very difficult. Suddenly you can see here the implications of making a change to that particular field. There's quite a lot implied in it. And this is a very valuable picture to show the business to go, actually, we can't just make a quick change. I need to do a lot more analysis. I need to make sure that none of these things are affected. Maybe there's a report that changes. Maybe that report actually is connected to some dashboards. So suddenly we're getting a picture here of the true impact analysis of making a change to that field. And any one of these, if I click on it, I can open that field up in Salesforce. It tells me about the field. It shows me which stories are linked to it. If I want to go and, let's go back to my user story over here. Let's say I want to add a field to this user story. So I say copy story link. Go back here. paste the story link, and now I've added this, and I think we need to go and update. And it's an update. So I can navigate my way around this tree, starting to add items to that user story. So suddenly I've got a view of not just this field, but the impact of the other fields. Maybe I look at this one and go, okay, because it says paste story link, it's not been added to the story. Great, so I can click an update on that, click attach. So very quickly I can start to make sure that every item that should be included in the org model, in the user story, has been added to make sure we have a full picture about the implications of those changes. So I've done 3 things for you. Number 1, we've put all the user stories in one place so we can manage them. Number 2, we've grouped them by release. And number 3, we've linked the user stories to the metadata items. And the release that comes out at the end of the week, you'll see another item here, another tab, and that will have a list of every single metadata item, and then it will identify the conflicts. So if you've got this item here, let's say the employee student object is being changed in this user story, but it's also being changed in 2 other user stories inside the same release, we'll identify those that it's being touched several times, and you can make sure that there are no conflicts. So this is a true shift left. Let's identify the issues up front. Let's get them resolved. Maybe you want to have a discussion with one of the team. I could mention Richard, why is this being used? He'll get pinged. So this is again the source of a discussion about how we resolve some of those conflicts. So I've said this is relatively straightforward. Yes, you can put all the user stories into one place. Yes, you could think about the releases you've got, very quickly create them and add user stories. This org model takes 2 minutes to get set up, takes about between 10 minutes and 2 hours to run for us to do all the analysis for you. And then you have all of this analysis at your fingertips for every single metadata item that we've pulled out for you. Objects, fields, validation rules, all the way down to manage packages. And I said, this view is available inside Elements, but I'm on a field here. If I click on that icon there, that will open up that item in setup. And it will pop our right panel. So everything I've just shown you inside Elements is visible to you inside setup. So there's the earned value field, and there is the right-hand panel with all our information, just as you saw inside Elements. So our view is also, how do we surface this information everywhere you need it? Inside setup, inside Jira, if you're using Copado, inside Copado for your DevOps. So reusing this information so it's a single source of all your metadata truth. So I said we do this in half an hour. We're at the half-hour stage. So some key takeaways. Getting a return on investment is easy. Now you may go, it's not easy. And my definition of easy is it achievable? Could you do this? And I think the answer is every one of you who's listening could say, yes, we could do this. The second one is this whole concept of shift left. The earlier you can get the analysis done, the earlier we can spot issues, the cheaper they are. And again, I know you're often fighting your teams where they went, just start building it. But if you can use some of these examples and these principles to buy you the time to do the proper analysis, you will save enormous amounts downstream. And the last is leverage tooling. I mean, you could do all this with a series of Excel spreadsheets, but it's just so hard. With the metadata API, the dependency API, the tooling API, you can now pull all this metadata out and do some really insightful things with it. So again, don't sit there with setup and spreadsheets. It's just too hard, particularly if you have a complex org. Some resources. If If you want a longer conversation with us, please go to Elements.cloud, book a demo. As I said at the beginning of this, everybody will be sent a recording of the webinar, and this recording will be up on our website on the newsroom. So let me stop recording and let's pick up any questions that people have got.